That's good. Thank you. So tell us, Jeremy, a bit about your journey into peacemaking.
Right. Well, I think it happened almost by accident. Well, providentially, you probably should say, because I was involved at different stages in studying a range of subjects. I grew up in South Africa and went to Rhodes University, which is in the south of that country, and studied history, philosophy, and politics. I was involved in my later student years with an organization called the Student Union for Christian Action, which arose as a response to this huge rally which took place in Pretoria, outside Pretoria, organized by Michael Cassidy, trying to bring Christians together to address the situation. That was back in 1978. And then 79, a group of us got together and felt really the issues hadn't probably been fully addressed. And we created SUCA, the Student Union for Christian Action, which was an organization which went over the divides of the then apartheid university structure. And in fact, apartheid affected both the division also between English speakers and Afrikaans speakers, because you had two separate sets of universities. So we got together and formed the Student Union for Christian Action, which was based on Christian ideas. In fact, I produced a paper for us to think about, which argued that which provided a Duovidian critique of apartheid, which is quite interesting that it came that it addressed it from that angle, because of course many of the Afrikaans university students needed to think about it in those terms as well. Part that was led by a student from Potchefstroom University, which of course is a Christian foundation, but very much within the Gereformeerde Kerk tradition. And so there's a sort of seed bed there for trying to get together as Christians to think about how we respond together across those divides. So that was quite formative for me. But then I went on to Cambridge, which I'd long wanted to do, and with a research scholarship to study 17th century English history. So I was sort of moving on to a totally different sphere, but somehow the South African situation still caught up with me there internally, as it were. You can't really escape those questions, and apartheid was really in its death throes at that stage, or we didn't know it. And how are you going to respond as Christians to all of that? So this really sowed the seeds for what was to happen later. And at Cambridge, I linked up with Michael Schluter. Now, I don't know how many of you have met or heard of Michael Schluter. Yeah. He is quite alive, quite a force to be reckoned with. He'd moved into Cambridge, and he had this vision of a biblical vision for the whole of society, especially drawing on the idea of the Old Testament as having a key role, not a theonomist, but certainly looking at it as a whole.
Jeremy, briefly, would you just briefly explain what theonomy would mean, and just for those who may not have thought of it?
Yes, theonomy is associated especially with the ideas of Rousas J. Rushdoony and all those chaps who really wanted to introduce the idea of a very highly focused reorientation of the whole society along biblical principles. Right? This was much more. Michael wasn't quite doing it quite in that way. He was trying to see how the sort of things, the way in which the Bible worked, or the biblical structure worked, had purchased on what we do today. For example, the importance of land and family and relationships, those sorts of things. These later on were distilled further into what became the relationships foundation, but that's going a bit ahead of us at that point. But with Michael, he and I got together and worked on a piece called Alternative Constitutional Settlements in South Africa, because we were both concerned about the situation in South Africa and how that would work out. I got on a plane with a document in Christmas 1976. Sorry, 1986. And took it out to South Africa, and that launched what then became the Newark Park Initiative. Newark Park was the home of Viscount and Lady Brentford, Jill Brentford, Crispin and Jill. Jill happened to be Michael's sister. So Crispin and Jill hosted a meeting, a small meeting of a number of selected South Africans from a number of different groupings in South Africa, including Chart van der Walt, for example, who was the vice chancellor of Potch University. Billy Esterhazy, for example, who was a professor of philosophy at Stellenbosch. Tema, who was a leading African churchman. Caesar Malabatsi, another African churchman, and then Richard Stevens, so-called Cullen. So you had a range of an interesting range of people, and we presented the papers there during that time we brought them to Newark Park and talked it through systematically, looking at what the different constitutional options might be, and then evaluating them in terms of biblical principles and practicalities. And so providing a safe space for people to talk to one another and really share, not in an adversarial way, much more in a constructive way, how things might go forward. Not rehearsing all the grievances, but really looking at the future possibilities at the middle distance. Unbeknownst to ourselves, this is a process which we later on defined as a track 2 process, not track 1, which is negotiations between the major parties themselves, or track 3, which is at a community or local or regional level, but rather people who are middle level, who have influence through to the major protagonists, who can influence the major protagonists in a principled way. And so we had a whole series of these consultations, starting in March 1987, through eventually to 1991.
Could I ask, Jeremy, can you give us the examples of the sorts of people that might be at this middle level? What sort of positions? Are they civil servants, for example?
Well, they're academics, church people, people who have influences of different kinds. We also had in South Africa something called the Broederbond. The Broederbond was the secret organization which had been behind the rise of the National Party in South Africa in 1948. But interestingly enough, in response to the Soweto riots of 1976, the Broederbond changed its character and became an instrument for change within Afrikanerdom. And so many of these figures from the Afrikaner side were themselves senior members of the Broederbond. And so had an important influence there upon the way things were developing. They were able to influence, to a certain extent, P.W. Botha, but things went badly wrong with P.W. It had gone badly wrong when he had his so-called Rubicon speech in 1985, which was supposed to have announced the release of Mandela. He didn't. He stepped back from that, and that then precipitated the 2 states of emergency. but the person who eventually came up with the goods was F.W. de Klerk, who was a conservative, but he came, interestingly enough, from a gereformeerde background rather than. This is how you have to understand Afrikaner church division. So you've got the Nederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk, the Dutch Reformed Church, the major one, which is seen as sort of middle of the road, was actually quite sort of stuck in its ways in a way, although not entirely. I did meet up with the moderator many times, who sadly was eventually assassinated by extreme Afrikaners who didn't like what he was doing. And then the Hervormde, which is more liberal, but actually was most politically conservative, and the Gereformeerde, which is the most theologically conservative, but the most politically open. And I think it was that influence. And Potchefstroom was where the Gereformeerders were, and Chart van der Walt, for example, who was quite a cautious person, but he was from that camp, from that background. So drawing together this small group of people, I think, then became part of a continuing process. We gradually drew in more senior people as we went along, leading to people from the ANC eventually, and from linking in through to the government. I often met with Wimpy de Klerk, who was the brother of FW, and although he wasn't from the same political position, he obviously had a role to play. And while we were involved in our Track 2 process in South Africa, there was another process going on at the same time, which I would call a Track 1.5, which is the Mel's Park process, a secret process, linking up the ANC directly with the National Party and working on methods of transition. Our process was much more looking at the broad middle distance issues. What should happen with land reform? What should happen with all the different areas of society? Theirs was much more looking at how transition would work, how you'd release the prisoners, how do you enter the state of emergency, etc., etc.
Now, could I ask you to say a little more about the Christian or theological principles? Because so far from what you've said, I think one could imagine you are merely sort of manipulating and choosing the winning sides and, playing politics. But can you say a little bit more about how this was an intrinsically biblical or Christian process?
Yes, that's a good point. Well, I think starting at the beginning, as Christians, there's a call to be peace builders, I think. The whole idea of shalom, of peace, is much richer than simply the absence of war. It's also building a society in which all can live together. And the whole idea of mishpat or justice is that of procedural bringing together of people in a way that builds relationships. And this I think Michael Schluter had this vision very much so of, for instance, in the Old Testament, seeing how that worked out, and then, of course, fulfilled much more in the New Testament in a universal way. So the vision, I think, underlying what we're doing, I think, was very significant. That this propelled us forward. That it wasn't simply a matter of pragmatic deals, but rather being animated by a vision, a common vision of what we should be doing, even though we might come from diametrically or very far removed positions politically.
Mm. And so was it an approach that you found resonated perhaps unexpectedly with the sort of middle level people that you talked to, or did it meet? I mean, when I've heard Michael Schluter speak, I've been so excited really by how, I mean, relationships, everyone knows they're important, and good relationships are the stuff of life. And when I first heard Michael saying, well, actually, this is what the Bible is all about,
yes.
it was a breath of fresh air almost.
Yes, sure.
Is that essentially what you found?
Yes, I think so. Those good people did resonate with that, and so in our South Africa work, we did more explicitly draw on Christian principles, biblical principles. because of course that resonated very powerfully with the Afrikaner establishment, as well as with the African nationalists, because they were very strongly influenced by the idea of exodus and those sorts of motifs, which are part of the biblical background.
May I ask whether the people who joined your track 2 process needed to be explicitly Christian in order to participate?
No, they didn't need to be explicitly Christian, but they did need to accept that there was a Christian motivation in what we were doing, and that we didn't hide our Christian affiliation, but we didn't make it an exclusive test for anybody's involvement.
Okay.
Yes, that's very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask Jeremy, if we could touch on some of the other situations where you've been involved
Yes.
more recently, and
Yes.
are most of them situations where Christian culture is pervasive?
Right.
And is it easier in those cases, or is those the cases where your approach works best?
Well, we were involved with Rwanda post-genocide, and we brought together people there. Although I have to say, those discussions we had were some of the most difficult of all, really, and the sheer trauma of that situation was almost unbearable, actually. And it was so we got some way in a way of trying to deal with these issues of justice and land reform, but that was about it, really. And it was, yeah. So, but then when we were involved in Sudan, which was at that point the undivided Sudan, the north, it had north and south. There was the war going on, of course, the second civil war, which had already resulted in 2 million people dying. We were invited by a former governor from one of the provinces, but who was in exile in the UK, who spoke to a friend of Michael's, who then put him in touch with us. And so we sort of I by that time moved to Kent. had been in Devon, and I'd been advising from there, but I'd had a parish in Devon, and then I had a job in the Diocese of Rochester here, and was trying to and was setting up the Sudan program from where I was, but it was really based in Cambridge. So we were trying to link up all the different regions of Sudan, but there, of course, we couldn't do that on an explicitly Christian basis. By then, the Relationships Foundation had been set up. So, whereas in the family of different organizations, the Jubilee Center is explicitly Christian. It's now gone online. It's not a virtual organization. The Relationships Foundation was not explicitly Christian, only implicitly so. Michael had written a book called The R Factor, which expressed the importance of relationships, but in a way which didn't assume any specific affiliation, but rather drew the vision from the Bible, sort of almost a distillation of thinking, which could be accepted regardless of particular confessional affiliation. So that's really the banner under which we worked on the Sudan question, primarily north-south, but also involving all the other areas. Again, it was a track 2 process, and the track 1 process had stalled. Really, there was the regional attempt to bring together people under the aegis of IGAD, which was the base in the Horn of Africa, really trying, Kenya and all those groups of countries trying to bring it together, and backed up especially by the UK and Norway. And then on the other hand, the Americans are trying to enforce sanctions, which I think was quite counterproductive on Sudan. And there was a complete logjam as far as the track one process was concerned. What we did, we still brought people together and talked about these things systematically, as we had been doing with the both the South African and Rwandan situations.
I'm looking forward to hearing what Andrei will say in a few minutes, because as I understand,
and again, it was a track two process.
Dialogue.
It is a track two process, which was, middle distance.
Yes.
And I think I don't know, Andrei, you know John Paul Ledreck. You'd know John Paul Ledreck, wouldn't you? I haven't met him, but his writings was quite similar to, I think, what we're trying to do ourselves. But I would sort of fallen into it rather than as something with directly interest.
Andrei, do come in.
So sorry, Andrei.
No, I just was gonna say, yeah, of course, the work of I've met with John Paul Lederach, and we had the chance to do a couple of things in Colombia, where he was very supportive of the peace process in Colombia, but also in Oxford, in a conference we organized, and yeah, definitely he talks a lot about this sort of track two, and like the in between, these sort of leaders who do the shuttle diplomacy and move between the different tracks, sometimes in the middle, but sometimes track 1.5, as you mentioned, or track 3. So that middle tier part of peace building is absolutely fundamental, and it's really important what you've been doing. Yeah. But please carry on.
Great, that's great.
Maybe just I can ask one more question before inviting Andrei, if he wants to ask anything else. You mentioned, Jeremy, that you might talk a little bit about the Ukraine situation.
Right.
There again, I suppose there's a fairly clear Christian root in the cultures involved.
There is. I think there is on Ukraine. We've been working Michael and I worked on started up, restarted, as it were, the organization, looking at Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and traveled out there quite a lot, and we're working on how to bring unification but in a way that is going to bring the two sides together, or rather the many different elements together in a peaceful way. And we produced a book called No Other Way to Peace in Korea. And in the course of doing this, we came upon the process of, we developed the notion of a mutual convergent development process. So you sort of have a roadmap which builds trust along the way. In the case of Korea, it was the idea of Korean Peninsula agriculture community, allowing exchange of agricultural goods between North and South, using a form of credit which would not break the sanctions, because it would not involve hard currency. It would be much more essentially a form of barter, I suppose, eventually. Then moving towards a much widened involvement, and so building trust along the way, using in a way the model of the European steel and coal, or coal and steel community in Europe, Western Europe, after the end of the Second World War, which created stepping stones between France and Germany, and which had been, and the other countries as well, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Italy, and so which had all been at war with one another. Then it drew them all together in what became the European Economic Community, the European Union, whatever you might think of the EU. It was a way of trying to bring people together using a series of stepping stones along the way, rather than forcing them to trade off or negotiate and raise all the different difficulties, looking at what you could do rather than the grievances, or trading grievances, or jostling for territory, or whatever the case might be. So that's the case for Korea. Now, of course, things have gone into reverse for various reasons, and a lot is to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I won't go into that. I won't sort of explain that too much. But Ukraine now, since we were also involved in Ukraine from 2014, and we were trying to find ways to build trust across the divides there too. And there we could do it much more, as you say, on a Christian basis, whereas in Korea you had to, it was much more relational thinking. I think in Ukraine one can be much more explicitly Christian because you're appealing to the major denominations there, the patriarchate, the Moscow and Ukraine patriarchate, which have had huge problems amongst themselves, of course, as well as the Catholics. And finding common basis for living together, which allows diversity of the regions, but at the same time builds commonalities. And there it's a mutual conversion process, starting with the grain, restoring the grain and agreement, and then moving to the lower Dnieper water, energy and environment community, as in a similar way to what happened in Europe with the European coal and steel community, then building to a confederation and a federation. So not trying to force the issue about whether the Ukrainians should give land or recognize the cession of land to Russia or not, but rather saying, well, these are the realities on the ground. Let us work here, and with all of that, finding ways to work together in a way that's going to be beneficial to everybody. That everybody needs water, for example. You want to restore the dam, get the water supply to that whole region, which is a vital breadbasket for the world. Get the nuclear power plant going. Be careful, restore the environment in and around the Dnieper River, etc. So if you focus on that, which is of common concern and benefit, then you're moving away from the discussions about what the long-term peace settlement will be. But if those relationships have been established, then the final settlement will really fall into place much better. And what we argue in the long term is having a much more decentralized sort of federation of provinces in Ukraine. So that, but I'd still call that a track 2 process, because it's not about forcing negotiation, but rather facilitating mutuality and cooperation. And it's not that but as Andrei, you were saying, you know, you have to work between the different processes. There's an economy of the different processes, that the track 1, track 2, the track 3, and if they're all in place, then the whole thing works so much better. But if you miss out, say, the track 2, I think, for example, one might argue, for example, in Northern Ireland, they got to track 1.5, but they forgot about track 2, really. And so there's no undergirding of peace. You have problems.
That's quite a poignant moment, isn't it, to think about in terms of where we're up to right now in that particular conflict. And is this a moment, Andrei, where you'd like to come in? And then, Jeremy, of course, you can add some more comments before we open it up for general discussion and questions.
Thank you, Richard. And I hope my internet connection is okay, and that you can listen to me, because somehow I've been missing out some bits of what Jeremy was saying towards the end. Thank you, Jeremy, for really fascinating life experience and contribution to peace building. I mean, really, really incredible to go from so many different, countries and learning along the way. So I have four sort of comments or with questions that I want to make, just very general. One is like to say that as I was listening to you, I was reminded of an event that we organized with Ron Williams to talk about the important role of the church in peace building. And the reason why we did that, and this was in 2017, was because in Colombia, we had negotiations with the FARC, the largest insurgency in the Western Hemisphere, and the Colombian government. And that peace agreement was put into a referendum to Colombian people. And unfortunately, many Presbyterian churches and some sectors of the Catholic Church campaign against the peace agreement. So a sector of the church, of different churches in Colombia, really played a really negative role in the process of trying to bring people together for reconciliation. So what we wanted to ask Ron Williams in that event is, what is the positive role that churches can play when divided societies cannot find a way through? And I think that you have given us a really good example, but you reminded me of that, so I wanted to bring that to the table to say that there is a really important role to play from faith-based mediation and interreligious dialogue. The second point that I wanted to make is that as I was listening to how the whole thing started, that brought to my mind again something that I've been trying to work a bit more and trying to conceptualize, because you said, I found peace building by chance, pretty much. You went to South Africa and this thing happened, and then that was a call, and then that thing unfolded in something bigger and bigger, and then you met Michael, and then the whole thing now is a long life project. And that's the reason why something similar happened to me. I didn't set up this organization thinking I'm going to be a peace builder. I mean, I actually ended up joining something that I thought it was a short-term campaign organized by some civil society guys in London. And suddenly I found dialogue, and dialogue changed my life. And then I became a peace builder. And when I look at the work that we do in the organization and that many people like you do, I think there is a concept that we could use to talk about a different way of doing peace building that is not based on, sort of log frames and timetables and long-term planning, but is really connected to spontaneity. And I call that spontaneous peace building. And I see many grassroots organizations and many faith-based organizations in Colombia being more spontaneous. You don't have all this strategic thinking and all of these, of course, that you need to have at the top level of peace building, as you were mentioning when you are doing track one, probably. But there is another one that is connected to the communities and to the grassroots that is more spontaneous, and that I think filters through all the different levels of peace building. So that was the second, probably you want to respond to that. That was the second comment I wanted to make. The third one is that I found really, of course, really interesting to hear that the most challenging engagement that you had was in Rwanda. And of course, in Rwanda, we had this horrendous genocide. And you said that as I understood, this was in a moment of post-genocide, after the genocide, and was on issues of justice. So I have a question there to ask you, because I wanted to hear, what did you find that you managed to move forward a bit in whatever small degree you could in terms of reconciliation, whether you try to appeal to forgiveness, or what if you managed to do something in the case of Rwanda in such a tremendous difficult situation, what was that, and how you felt that you could try to move forward in that dimension? And then the final one is something that I think I've heard across all the cases that you have spoken about, that I think is, again, very Lederackian, and is that peace building is about relationships. is all about relationships. And so if we move, and you were saying, in the case of Korea, and we were thinking about the model of the European Union, they were economic relationships, but relationships nonetheless. And sometimes these economic relationships where there is a win-win situation can move things forward, but you are rebuilding those relationships. And when we miss the focus of what peace building is about, and we think that is something else than is not, this basic idea of rebuilding relationships, sometimes we get lost in the process. And I think that's a really challenging dimension, because when you hear about what's happening in Ukraine, or in the Middle East at the moment, there is a lot of support for military action, and that military action actually does not help to build relationships. And I think that's the very difficult part of how, there is all this public discourse that sometimes promotes military solutions and undermines the important effort that organizations like yours and other organizations try to do in terms of rebuilding relationships. I will end it there.
Sure, I agree. No, I think I would agree with you. And I think you asked about Rwanda. Well, it was the least. Well, I don't think we got the same traction there that we got, say, in South Africa or Sudan. I think Sudan, there was a breakthrough in Sudan. Not sufficient follow through, I have to say, but there was a breakthrough nevertheless. In Rwanda, the thing was that the RPF was so deeply entrenched in the power of the RPF, and then of course, I mean, they were extraordinary, really. I mean, they dominated. They managed to conquer they overthrow the government of what was then Zaire, and created. They marched right across the country. But they were themselves threatened by the Hutu just outside the country. This is all swirling around. And really, all that we could do was, and I wasn't directly involved in this, I have to say, so that was one of the ones I was less closely involved with, but I was there, and I was at the different conferences. The issue of the problem of all the people in prison after the genocide, who were, of course, accused of being part of the genocide. The genocide had been so widespread because the most of the killings had been done by people at roadblocks with machetes. I mean, it was not something you could pin on where there was a small group of people who managed to dominate the airwaves and spew out these horrible commands and kill the cockroaches, things like that. And this was a sign that they went out and they said, do what you have to do, these sorts of things. Then go out to the roadblocks and just start massacring people as they came through, and of course in other places. So the complicity was very widespread, and there were all these people in prison. And the only way it could be dealt with is not through the formal legal process, but through community courts, the gacaca. And that's the one thing which helped to unblock it and empty those prisons, which were still full of Hutu and others condemned. And of course, there were moderate Hutu caught in the middle of all of this as much, and they were just as much the victims as anybody. And then the whole problem had been precipitated by agricultural crisis, and that needed to be addressed. That there was a real problem of agricultural yield and so on. And it was an issue which we could do a little bit about, but. And I think Rwanda turned around, but it's still it's a very highly controlled society, very dominated by a very small clique of people, Tutsi clique, and so there's only so much you can do, and they're threatened by these others across the way, with everything swirling around the whole Great Lakes region. It all has to be dealt with as one, and really, unless it's dealt with as a whole, you know, Eastern Congo as much as Burundi and Rwanda all together. As far as Sudan goes, there was a breakthrough, and it coincided with the change the changes at track 1 level too. And so I think what we were doing at track 2 was able then to feed into the track 1 process. You had then the official process that the Americans, unlike the Americans, the UK and the Norwegians got onto the same page, and together facilitated a process in Kenya, which was chaired by a Kenyan general, the Machaka's process, and that became quite effective. And I think the civil war was coming to a point where they realized neither side could win. And so they did make a deal. There was a ceasefire, and then moving towards the comprehensive peace agreement, and so on. At meantime, of course, the whole situation in Darfur blew up. It was starting, the seeds of it were starting there, and I fear it's the toxicity of that situation which has now infected the whole of Sudan again, because it was the very people, the Janjaweed, who were conducting the massacres in Darfur, who then became the rapid support groups who have caused total chaos in the whole country now. So it was, and also I fear that more should have been done with the southern Sudanese. In fact, the two factions were as much hated each other as much as or more than they did the government. But sorry, that's a bit of a ramble. But we had them all. We had them all with us, all around. All the different groups from all the different regions were there. The difference was that the track 1 process was very much more formal, arm twisting by the international community. They wanted to get an agreement, sign the paper. Whereas we were obviously not doing that. It was a much more place where people could relax and just share their hopes and fears and talk through the longer term issues. I don't know if that...
And then Andrei asked about spontaneity, I think, didn't he, as well? And then also about church roles and
the spontaneity, yes, of course.
Economic relationships.
Yeah, that's all very much part of the mix. I agree. You need places. You need the formal. You need the different venues and the different. I think there's an economy of peace building. So you've got, you need track 1, you need the track 1.5, you need the track 2, and then track 3. They all need to work together and feed into one another. And when they're working together, that's when you get most effect. If you and the same people can be involved in the different processes. For example, Billy Esterhazy in our South Africa process, who was part of our group very much, but he was also very much part of the Mel's Park 1.5, track 1.5 as well, and others as well from our group. So they sort of move into the different contexts. But the fact that they could talk to one another much more freely and openly and get the support of what we were saying, and we could joke with them about, oh, you're involved with that and so on. It just took the steam out of it, the sort of hostility and the sort of pressures. It helped them to depressurize and as you say, be spontaneous.
Andrei, do you want to come back and
No,
Thanks,
I think
Jeremy.
we could
Anything else?
we should listen to the rest of the participants and move on to other
Yes,
questions.
yes. Sorry, it becomes very anecdotal and
No, it's been fascinating.
rambling.
No, it's very, very helpful. And thank you. And thank you, Andrei. So now should we invite others to switch on their cameras and microphones and ask questions as well? Do feel free, please. And I shall stop the recording there, I think, so that